Jack Morrison pulled his old pickup truck closer to the ranch house as snow whipped across his windshield. The weather radio had been screaming warnings all day about the worst blizzard to hit northern Arizona in 20 years. At 52, he'd seen plenty of bad storms, but this one felt different. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in just 2 hours. He was checking on his cattle one last time before the storm really hit, when he saw something that made him slam on the brakes. Through the swirling snow, 2 dark shapes lay motionless near his fence line. At first, he thought they might be fallen trees or maybe some of his cattle that had wandered too far from shelter, but as he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. They were people. 2 women, and they were huge. Even lying in the snow, Jack could tell these weren't ordinary folks. They had to be well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and powerful builds that would make most men look small. Their long black hair was covered in ice, and their lips had turned a frightening shade of blue. Jack had lived alone on this ranch for 8 years since his divorce. He wasn't used to making quick decisions about other people anymore, but looking at these 2 women slowly freezing to death in his pasture, there was really no choice to make. The nearest hospital was 3 hours away on a good day. In this storm, the roads would be impossible. He jogged back to his truck and drove as close as he could get. The first woman was unconscious, her breathing so shallow he had to put his ear to her mouth to make sure she was still alive. She wore traditional Native American clothing under a heavy winter coat, but it wasn't nearly enough for this kind of weather. Her sister lay a few feet away, mumbling something he couldn't understand in what sounded like Apache. Getting them into his truck was like moving 2 full-grown men. Jack worked construction for 15 years before taking over the ranch, so he wasn't weak, but these women were solid muscle, and dead weight is always harder to lift. He managed to get the first one into the passenger seat, then struggled to get her sister into the back of the extended cab. By the time he got them both loaded, his hands were numb and his back was screaming. The conscious one kept trying to say something, but her teeth were chattering so hard he couldn't make out the words. Jack cranked up the heat as high as it would go and drove carefully back to his house, fighting the wind that tried to push his truck off the narrow ranch road. His ranch house was nothing fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place his grandfather built in the 1940s. But it was warm and dry, and right now that was all that mattered. Jack half-carried, half-dragged both women inside, getting them settled in his guest bedroom. The unconscious one was in bad shape. Her skin felt like ice, and she wasn't responding to anything. He grabbed every blanket in the house and piled them on top of both women. Then he started a fire in the old wood stove and put water on to boil for hot tea or soup, whatever they could handle when they woke up. His hands shook as he worked, and not just from the cold. He'd never dealt with hypothermia before, but he knew it could kill people fast. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors. Jack's power flickered a few times but held. He sat in a chair between the guest bed and the fire, listening to the women's breathing and praying they'd make it through the night. Every few minutes, he'd check their pulse and try to warm their hands and feet. Around midnight, the one who'd been mumbling earlier opened her eyes. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with confusion. She looked around the room, then at Jack, then at her sister lying beside her. When she tried to sit up, Jack gently pushed her back down. "Don't move too fast," he said quietly. "You've been out in the cold too long. Your body needs time to warm up." The woman stared at him for a long moment, studying his face. Then she looked at her sister again, reaching over to touch her forehead. Jack could see the worry in her eyes, the way she watched every breath her sister took. "She's going to be okay," Jack said, hoping it was true. "You both are. The storm should pass by morning, and then we can figure out how to get you where you need to go." But the woman just shook her head slowly, like she was trying to tell him something important, something that would change everything about what he thought was just a simple rescue in a snowstorm. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and snow kept piling higher around the little ranch house. Jack had no idea that saving these 2 women would turn his quiet, lonely life completely upside down. He thought he was just being a good neighbor, doing what any decent person would do. He had no clue about the ancient traditions and sacred debts that would soon make these giant Apache sisters a permanent part of his world. For now, all that mattered was keeping them alive until morning. The rest he'd learn soon enough. When Jack woke up the next morning, the storm had finally stopped. Sunlight streamed through his kitchen window, making the snow outside sparkle like diamonds. The silence felt strange after hours of howling wind. He made coffee and checked on his unexpected guests, finding both women awake and sitting up in bed. The one who'd been conscious the night before was helping her sister drink water from a glass. Both of them looked much better, though still pale and tired. In the daylight, Jack could see just how remarkable these women really were. They had to be 6.5 feet tall, maybe more. Their shoulders were broader than most men he knew, and their hands looked strong enough to crush rocks. "I'm Jack Morrison," he said from the doorway, holding his coffee mug. "This is my ranch. How are you feeling?" The woman who'd been awake first smiled and nodded. "I am Ayanna," she said in accented but clear English. "This is my sister Chenoa. We owe you our lives." Chenoa looked up at Jack with eyes just like her sister's, dark and intelligent. She was clearly the younger of the two, maybe in her mid-20s, while Ayanna seemed closer to 30. When Chenoa tried to speak, her voice came out as a whisper, rough from the cold. "Thank you," she managed to say. "We thought we were going to die out there." Jack felt embarrassed by their gratitude. Anyone would have done the same thing. "What were you doing out there in that storm? Your car break down?" Ayanna's expression grew serious. "Our truck stopped working about 5 miles from here. We were traveling to visit our grandmother's burial place to bring her offerings and pray. It's something we do every winter, but we left too late. The storm came faster than the weather report said it would. Where's your family? People must be worried about you." The sisters exchanged a look that told Jack there was more to this story. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "We don't have much family left. Our parents died when we were young. Our grandmother raised us until she passed 5 years ago. Since then, it's just been the two of us." Chenoa's voice was getting stronger. "People on the reservation, they think we're strange. They whisper about us, say we're cursed or blessed, depending on who you ask. Our size makes them uncomfortable." Jack looked at both women, trying to understand. He'd lived in Arizona his whole life, and knew a little about Native American culture, but not much about day-to-day life on the reservations. "Cursed? Because you're tall?" Ayanna shook her head. "It's more than that. Our great-great-grandfather was a famous Apache warrior named Thunder Bear. He was known for his incredible size and strength. People said he could lift a horse over his head and fight off 10 men at once. Most people thought those were just stories, legends that grew bigger over time. But they weren't stories," Chenoa added quietly. "The women in our family, every few generations, we inherit his gifts. Our grandmother was like us. Our great-aunt, too. We're stronger than normal people, tougher, harder to hurt. It scares some folks." Jack set down his coffee mug, trying to process what they were telling him. These women were claiming to have some kind of supernatural strength passed down through their bloodline. It sounded crazy, but looking at their size and build, he had to admit they didn't look like normal people. "So you were traveling alone to visit your grandmother's grave?" "Every winter," Ayanna confirmed. "It's our duty to honor her spirit and ask for her guidance. The burial ground is sacred to our family, hidden in the mountains about 30 miles from here. We've made this trip together for 5 years now, but we've never been caught in a storm like that." Chenoa pushed herself up straighter in bed. Even sitting down, she was nearly as tall as Jack standing up. "The tribal council doesn't approve of our trips. They say we should let the old ways die, focus on modern life instead, but our grandmother made us promise to keep the traditions alive. That's why we live apart from the reservation," Ayanna explained. "We have a small cabin about an hour from here, closer to the burial grounds. We work odd jobs, help ranchers during cattle season, whatever pays enough to get by. It's a simple life, but it's ours." Jack was starting to understand why these women seemed so different. They weren't just physically unusual. They were carrying the weight of family traditions that other people didn't understand or accept, living on their own, honoring their ancestors in ways that made their own tribe uncomfortable. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're completely recovered," he said. "And until we can figure out what to do about your truck. The roads won't be clear for at least another day or two." Both sisters looked at each other again, and Jack got the feeling they were having some kind of silent conversation. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "Jack Morrison, you saved our lives when you could have just driven past. In our culture, that creates a debt that cannot be repaid with simple thanks." "You don't owe me anything," Jack said quickly. "I just did what anyone should do." Chenoa shook her head firmly. "Our grandmother taught us about the old ways, the sacred obligations. When someone saves your life, you belong to them until you can save theirs in return. It's called the life debt, and it's not something we can ignore." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. The way both women were looking at him with complete seriousness told him this wasn't some quaint tradition they could just forget about. This was real to them, as real as anything in their lives. What exactly does that mean? He asked, though he was starting to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Jack learned the answer to his question the very next day. He woke up to the sound of wood splitting outside his kitchen window. Not the normal crack of branches breaking under snow weight, but the deep, powerful sound of an axe biting through thick logs. Except he didn't own an axe that could make sounds like that. He pulled on his boots and coat and walked outside to find Ayanna standing next to his woodpile, or what used to be his woodpile. She'd taken the huge oak logs he'd been saving for emergencies and split them into perfect firewood, using what looked like a regular splitting maul. The only problem was, those logs were too big and heavy for his tractor's hydraulic splitter to handle. He'd been planning to rent a commercial splitter come spring. "Morning," Ayanna said cheerfully, not even breathing hard. She lifted another massive log onto the splitting block like it weighed nothing. The log had to be 3 feet across and 4 feet long, easily 300 pounds of solid oak. Jack had needed help from 2 neighbors just to roll those logs off his truck when he bought them. "How are you doing that?" Jack asked, staring as she brought them all down with perfect accuracy. The log split clean in 2 with a sound like thunder. "Doing what?" Ayanna seemed genuinely confused by his question. Before Jack could answer, he heard his cattle making noise from the far pasture. Not their normal lowing, but the distressed sounds they made when something was wrong. He jogged over to the fence and saw the problem immediately. A huge pine tree had fallen across his fence during the storm, crushing about 50 feet of posts and wire. His cattle were milling around the gap, confused about whether they were supposed to stay in the pasture or wander out. "That's going to take me all day to fix," Jack muttered, thinking about the tractor work and manual labor involved in moving a tree that size. Chenoa appeared beside him, looking much healthier than she had the day before. "I can move it," she said simply. Jack looked at her, then at the tree. It was a massive ponderosa pine, probably 80 feet long and 3 feet thick at the base. "That tree weighs several tons. I'll need to cut it into sections and use my tractor to drag them away." Chenoa just smiled and walked over to the fallen tree. She studied it for a moment, then positioned herself at the thick end near the broken stump. Jack watched in complete amazement as she grabbed the trunk with both hands, set her feet, and lifted. The entire tree rose off the ground like it was made of cardboard. Chenoa walked backward, dragging the massive pine away from the fence as easily as Jack might move a fallen branch. When she'd pulled it clear of his property, she set it down gently and brushed the bark off her hands. "There," she said. "Now you just need to fix the fence posts." Jack stood there with his mouth open, trying to process what he'd just seen. A woman who couldn't weigh more than 250 pounds had just moved a tree that should have required heavy machinery. It wasn't possible, but he'd watched it happen. "How?" he finally managed to ask. "Our grandmother always said we inherited the strength of the old warriors," Chenoa replied. "Most people think it's just stories, but we've always been different. Stronger than we should be." The next few hours turned into the most productive morning Jack had experienced in years. While he worked on replacing the fence posts, both sisters tackled jobs around his ranch that he'd been putting off for months. Ayanna finished splitting his entire winter wood supply, then moved on to stacking hay bales in his barn. Each bale weighed about 60 pounds, and she carried 3 at a time like they were pillows. Chenoa fixed a section of his barn roof that had been leaking for 2 years. She simply climbed up there without a ladder, pulling herself onto the roof with her fingertips, then bent the twisted metal sheeting back into place by hand. When one of the support beams had cracked, she held it steady while Jack nailed in a replacement board. Her grip was so solid, the beam didn't move even a fraction of an inch. By lunchtime, they'd accomplished more work than Jack usually managed in a week. His ranch had never looked so good. The sisters worked together with an efficiency that came from years of practice, anticipating each other's movements and helping without being asked. "This is incredible," Jack said as they sat down for sandwiches. "You two could probably run a construction company." Ayanna laughed. "We've talked about it, but people get nervous when they see what we can do. They ask too many questions, want to know how it's possible. It's easier to work for ranchers who just care about getting the job done. Plus," Chenoa added, "we move around a lot. Never stay in one place too long. People start to notice things, start talking. Better to keep moving." Jack understood what they meant. If word got out about their abilities, they'd probably end up as some kind of circus attraction or scientific experiment. The modern world didn't have room for people like them, especially when their gifts came from ancient bloodlines and spiritual traditions that most folks didn't believe in. But watching them work, seeing the joy they took in using their strength to help someone who'd helped them, Jack realized something important. These women weren't just paying back a debt, they were sharing a gift that they'd probably never been able to share openly before. For the first time in their lives, they could use their full strength without hiding it or making excuses. And for the first time in years, Jack's ranch felt alive again. Having people around who could tackle any job, who worked with enthusiasm and skill, reminded him why he'd loved this place before loneliness and endless chores had worn him down. As the afternoon wore on, Jack began to understand that the life debt Ayanna had mentioned wasn't just about obligation. It was about finding a place where they could belong, where their gifts were valued instead of feared, and whether he was ready for it or not, his quiet, solitary life was about to become something completely different. 3 days after the storm, Jack's neighbor Pete drove up the ranch road in his old pickup truck. Pete owned the spread next to Jack's and had been checking on folks after the blizzard. When he climbed out of his truck and saw Ayanna carrying a refrigerator-sized hay feeder across the yard by herself, his jaw dropped so far Jack thought it might hit the ground. "Jack," Pete said slowly, not taking his eyes off Ayanna, "who exactly are your new helpers?" "Long story," Jack replied. "This is Ayanna and her sister Chenoa. I found them during the storm." Pete watched as Chenoa appeared around the corner of the barn, carrying what looked like half a ton of steel roofing material under one arm. "Jack, buddy, I've known you for 15 years. You want to tell me what's really going on here?" Before Jack could answer, Ayanna set down the hay feeder and walked over. Even with Pete being a tall man at 6'2", she towered over him by several inches. Her handshake looked like it could crush walnuts. "We're helping Jack with his ranch work," she said politely. "He saved our lives, so now we serve him until the debt is repaid." Pete looked from Ayanna to Jack to Chenoa, who was now bending steel roofing sheets into perfect shapes with her bare hands. "Serve him? Jack, what kind of arrangement is this exactly?" Jack had been dreading this conversation. "It's complicated, Pete. They have this cultural tradition about life debts. I tried to tell them they don't owe me anything, but they won't listen." "We cannot listen," Ayanna corrected firmly. "Our grandmother taught us the old ways. When someone saves your life, you belong to them until you can save theirs in return. It is sacred law, older than any government or paper contract." Pete scratched his head. "So you're telling me these two women are going to live here and work for free until they save Jack's life?" "That's about the size of it," Jack admitted. "And how long might that take?" Chenoa joined the conversation, brushing metal shavings off her hands. "It could be months, years, or decades. The debt ends only when we preserve Jack's life as he preserved ours. Until then, we guard him and his property with our lives." Pete was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he turned to Jack. "You know people are going to talk, right? 2 young women living here with you, working without pay. Folks might get the wrong idea." Jack felt his face get hot. "It's not like that, Pete. They sleep in the guest room, I sleep in my room. This is purely about their cultural obligations." "I believe you," Pete said quickly, "but you know how people are. And Jack, I've got to ask, what they're doing with that metal and those hay feeders, that's not normal human strength. What aren't you telling me?" Jack looked at both sisters, unsure how much to reveal. Ayanna spoke up instead. "We are descended from powerful Apache warriors. We inherited gifts that make us stronger than most people. This frightens some, so we usually hide our abilities. But Jack saved our lives, so we hide nothing from him." Pete stared at her for a few seconds, then started laughing. Not mean laughter, but the kind that comes when someone's world gets turned upside down. "In 30 years of ranching, I've seen some strange things, but this beats them all. Jack, you found yourself a couple of real-life superheroes. They're just people, Pete. People with unusual abilities and a strong sense of honor." Over the next week, Jack tried several times to convince the sisters that their debt was already paid. Their work had improved his ranch more in 1 week than he'd managed in the previous year. His fences were stronger than ever, his barn was completely repaired, and they'd even fixed his tractor's transmission with nothing but hand tools and determination. But every time he brought up the subject, both women became absolutely rigid in their refusal to leave. "You do not understand," Ayanna explained one evening as they sat around his kitchen table. "This is not about work or payment. This is about honor, about keeping our grandmother's teachings alive. She told us that the life debt is sacred because it connects people across all boundaries of tribe, color, or culture. Chenoa nodded in agreement. Our grandmother said that when someone saves your life, they become family. Not blood family, but chosen family. The debt isn't just about serving someone, it's about protecting them like you would protect your own brother or sister. Jack tried a different approach. But what about your own lives? Don't you want to get married, have families of your own? You can't spend the rest of your lives taking care of me. We can marry if we choose, Ayana replied. But any man who wants to marry one of us would have to understand that our first loyalty is to you. Most men wouldn't accept that. And honestly, Chenoa added, we've never been very good at finding men who aren't scared of us. Our size and strength make dating complicated. Jack was beginning to understand that he wasn't just dealing with a temporary cultural obligation. These women had lived their entire adult lives as outsiders, too different for their own tribe and too unusual for the modern world. The life debt wasn't just a burden for them. It was the first time they'd found a place where they could belong completely. But Jack also knew that having two giant Apache women permanently living on his ranch was going to create problems he wasn't prepared for. People would ask questions he couldn't answer. Government officials might get involved, and he was starting to realize that Ayana and Chenoa's protective instincts were much stronger than he'd anticipated. The next morning he found out just how strong those instincts could be when a car full of strangers pulled up his driveway, asking questions about his new employees. The sisters' reaction to these unexpected visitors would teach Jack that their promise to guard him with their lives wasn't just empty words. The trouble started on a Thursday morning when Jack saw dust clouds coming up his ranch road. 3 vehicles were heading his way: a black SUV, a white sedan, and an old pickup truck he didn't recognize. Jack had lived on this remote ranch long enough to know that when multiple strangers showed up unannounced, it usually meant problems. The black SUV pulled up first and 2 men in expensive suits climbed out. Jack recognized them immediately as representatives from Redstone Development, the company that had been trying to buy his land for the past 2 years. They wanted to build a resort and golf course where his cattle currently grazed. Mr. Morrison, the older man called out as he approached. His name was Williams, and he had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. We need to discuss your property situation. Behind Williams, his partner Rodriguez was taking pictures of Jack's ranch with a fancy camera. But both men stopped cold when they saw Ayana emerge from the barn. Even from a distance, her size and presence were intimidating. The white sedan contained 2 people Jack had never seen before: a woman with a clipboard and a man with a badge clipped to his belt. They looked like government officials of some kind, probably county inspectors or social workers. The pickup truck held the biggest surprise. 3 Native American men climbed out, all wearing traditional clothing mixed with modern work clothes. The oldest one, a man with gray hair and weathered hands, looked directly at the sisters with an expression Jack couldn't read. "This is interesting," Williams said, watching as Chenoa joined her sister. Both women stood protectively between the visitors and Jack. "Mr. Morrison, we weren't aware you'd hired security personnel." "They're not security," Jack replied carefully. "They're helping me with ranch work." The man with the badge stepped forward. "I'm Officer Martinez with County Social Services. We received a complaint about labor violations on this property. Something about 2 women working without proper documentation or wages." Jack felt his stomach drop. Someone had called the authorities on him, probably hoping to cause enough trouble that he'd be forced to sell his land to pay legal fees. The gray-haired Native American man approached slowly, his eyes never leaving the sisters. When he spoke, it was in Apache, but Jack could tell from Ayana and Chenoa's body language that they understood every word. Their responses were short and sharp, like they were answering unwelcome questions. "What's he saying?" Jack asked. Ayana's voice was tight with controlled anger. "His name is Robert Crowfeather. He's from the tribal council on our old reservation. He says we've abandoned our people and our responsibilities. He wants us to return for a formal hearing about our behavior." Chenoa stepped forward, making herself look even taller and more imposing. When she spoke in Apache, her voice carried across the yard like a challenge. Robert Crowfeather's expression darkened, and he said something back that made both sisters stiffen. "He's threatening us," Chenoa translated for Jack. "He says if we don't return voluntarily, the tribal police will come get us. He claims we're fugitives from tribal justice." Officer Martinez was taking notes on everything he saw. "Mr. Morrison, I need to see documentation that these women are legally employed here. Work permits, wage records, housing agreements. Williams smirked. Of course, if these labor issues create legal problems for you, Mr. Morrison, Redstone Development would be happy to take this property off your hands. We could settle any outstanding debts and legal fees. Jack realized he was being squeezed from multiple directions. The development company was using government officials and tribal politics to pressure him into selling. They'd probably orchestrated this whole confrontation. But before Jack could respond, Ayanna stepped forward. The change in her demeanor was dramatic. Where she'd been calm and respectful before, now she radiated a quiet menace that made all three groups of visitors take an unconscious step backward. "You are on Jack Morrison's land without invitation," she said in a voice that carried the authority of generations. "You bring accusations and threats to a man who has done nothing wrong. This is not acceptable." Officer Martinez tried to reassert his authority. "Ma'am, I'm conducting an official investigation. I need to see proof that you're being treated fairly here." Chenoa moved to stand beside her sister, and together they formed an imposing wall between the officials and Jack. "We are here by our own choice," Chenoa said firmly. "We owe Jack Morrison a life debt, and we will not leave until it is repaid. No government official and no tribal council has the right to interfere with sacred obligations." Robert Crowfeather said something angry in Apache, pointing at both sisters. Ayanna's response was swift and final. Jack didn't need a translation to understand that she'd just told the tribal representative exactly where he could go. Williams was getting nervous. The sisters' protective stance and obvious physical capabilities weren't part of whatever plan he'd hatched. "Mr. Morrison, perhaps we could discuss this situation somewhere more private, away from your employees." "These women aren't going anywhere," Jack said, finding his voice. "And neither am I. This is my land, and I haven't broken any laws." Officer Martinez consulted his clipboard. "I still need to verify working conditions and compensation. If these women are working without proper wages—" "We require no wages," Ayanna interrupted. "We serve Jack Morrison because he saved our lives. Our compensation is the honor of repaying our debt." "That's not how labor law works," Martinez replied. "Everyone has to be paid minimum wage regardless of cultural traditions." Chenoa laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You want to pay us minimum wage for the work we do? Yesterday I moved a 2-ton boulder that was blocking Jack's irrigation ditch. I carried it a quarter mile and set it down gently enough not to crack it. Calculate the minimum wage for that job." The challenge in her voice was clear. Jack watched as all the visitors began to realize they were dealing with people who didn't fit into any of their normal categories. The sisters weren't employees, weren't victims, and definitely weren't intimidated by official titles or legal threats. Williams tried one more approach. "Mr. Morrison, you have to understand the position this puts you in. Unusual labor arrangements, questions about documentation, tribal disputes. These issues could tie up your property in legal problems for years. Wouldn't it be simpler to just sell and avoid all this trouble?" That's when Jack finally understood what was really happening. This whole confrontation was designed to overwhelm him with problems he couldn't solve, forcing him to sell his ranch to make the troubles go away. It was a coordinated attack on his property and his peace of mind. But looking at Ayanna and Chenoa standing guard like ancient warriors protecting their chief, Jack realized something important. For the first time in years, he wasn't facing his problems alone. And these particular protectors weren't going to be intimidated by suits, badges, or tribal politics. The strange incident started 3 days after the confrontation with the officials and developers. Jack woke up Friday morning to find his cattle bunched together in the center of the pasture, all facing outward like they were protecting something. He'd never seen them behave that way before. When he rode out to check on them, he discovered why they were acting so weird. Dead coyotes, 7 of them, laid out in a perfect circle around his water tank. They weren't torn up or bloody like they'd fought each other. They just looked like they'd laid down and died peacefully in their sleep. But coyotes didn't do that, and they definitely didn't arrange themselves in ceremonial patterns. "Ayanna," he called when he got back to the house. "Can you come look at something?" Both sisters followed him out to the pasture. When they saw the dead coyotes, they exchanged one of those silent looks that Jack was getting used to. Ayanna knelt beside one of the animals and placed her hand on its head, murmuring something in Apache. "What happened to them?" Jack asked. Chenoa was walking around the circle, studying the ground. "They were protecting your cattle from something. Something that would have killed or scattered your herd during the night. Protecting them. Coyotes don't protect cattle. They eat them. Ayanna stood up and looked directly at Jack. The land knows you saved our lives. It's showing its gratitude. Jack stared at her. The land? You mean the ground decided to kill coyotes to protect my cattle? Not the ground, Chenoa corrected. The spirits that live in this place. Our grandmother taught us that some lands hold memories, especially places where important things happen. When someone performs a great kindness, the land remembers. Over the next week, more impossible things started happening around Jack's ranch. His irrigation well, which had been producing less water every year, suddenly started flowing stronger than it had in decades. The water was clearer and colder than before, and it never seemed to run low no matter how much his cattle drank. His hayfields, which should have been dormant in winter, started showing patches of green grass that grew thick and nutritious. His cattle were getting fatter and healthier even though he wasn't feeding them any extra grain. The fence posts that Ayanna and Chenoa had installed were growing, not just settling into the ground but actually getting taller and stronger. Jack measured them twice to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The wooden posts were somehow adding 6 inches of height and becoming harder than iron. Most strange of all were the eagles. Jack had seen maybe 1 or 2 eagles near his ranch in all the years he'd lived there. Now there were dozens of them, circling overhead during the day and roosting in his trees at night. They didn't hunt his chickens or cause any trouble. They just watched, like sentries keeping guard. This is getting weird, Jack told the sisters one evening. Really weird. I'm starting to think you two brought some kind of magic with you. Ayanna was cooking dinner, making some kind of traditional stew that smelled incredible. Magic is your word for it. We would say the land is showing its appreciation. But how? How does dirt and grass and water just decide to help someone? Chenoa looked up from the leather she was working on, making what looked like traditional Apache crafts. Our grandmother said that everything has spirit. Everything is alive in ways most people don't understand. Trees, rocks, water, animals. They all have awareness. When someone does something truly good, something that honors life, the spirits notice. Jack sat down at his kitchen table, trying to wrap his mind around what they were telling him. So you're saying that because I picked you up during a snowstorm, some kind of nature spirits decided to bless my ranch? Not just because you picked us up, Ayanna corrected. Because you risked your own safety to save strangers. Because you opened your home without asking for anything in return. Because you defended us when people came to cause trouble. The spirits recognize true kindness. But this is crazy. Water doesn't just decide to flow better. Animals don't arrange themselves in patterns to send messages. Chenoa smiled. You live in a world that teaches you everything is separate. Everything is just dead matter following physical rules. But our people know different. We know that consciousness exists in places and things you don't expect. That night, Jack lay in bed listening to sounds outside his window that he'd never heard before. Not just the normal ranch sounds of cattle and wind, but something else. It sounded almost like singing, very soft and far away. When he looked out his window, he could see the eagles perched in his trees, and he could swear they were the ones making the sound. The next morning brought the most dramatic proof yet that something supernatural was protecting his ranch. Jack woke up to find Robert Crowfeather's pickup truck stuck in a mud hole that definitely hadn't been there the day before. The tribal council representative was standing beside his vehicle, covered in mud and looking frustrated. The road was solid when I drove in here last night, Robert told Jack when he came out to investigate. I was coming to talk to the sisters again, try to convince them to come home. But during the night, water just started bubbling up from underground, turning everything to mud. Jack looked around. The road was perfectly dry everywhere except for a 20-foot circle around Robert's truck. The mud was so deep and thick that even a tractor would have trouble pulling the pickup out. Ayanna and Chenoa appeared from the house, took one look at the situation, and started laughing. Not mean laughter, but the kind that comes from seeing something both ridiculous and fitting. The land doesn't want you here, Chenoa told Robert bluntly. Maybe you should listen to what it's trying to tell you. Robert's face darkened with anger. This is some kind of trick. You two are playing games with me. We were asleep in the house all night, Ayanna replied calmly. Ask Jack, we didn't leave our room until just now. Jack had to confirm it was true. Both sisters had been inside all night, and he was a light sleeper who would have heard if they'd left the house. There was no way they could have created the mud hole or damaged Robert's truck. I'll call a tow truck, Robert muttered, pulling out his cell phone. But when he tried to make the call, his phone showed no signal. Jack checked his own phone and found full bars. Perfect reception. That's strange, Jack said. I always get good cell service here. Chenoa grinned. Maybe the spirits don't want him calling for help. Maybe they want him to walk home and think about why he's not welcome here. In the end, that's exactly what Robert had to do. His phone never picked up a signal. Jack's tractor mysteriously wouldn't start, and the mud around his truck kept getting deeper every time he tried to dig it out. Finally, he gave up and started walking toward the main road, muttering in Apache about witchcraft and cursed ground. As soon as he was out of sight, Jack's tractor started on the first try and the mud hole began draining away like someone had pulled a plug. Within an hour, the road was completely dry again. Jack stood there staring at the spot where the mud had been, finally accepting that his life had moved far beyond anything he could explain with logic or science. The sisters hadn't just brought their physical strength to his ranch. They'd brought something much older and more powerful, something that was determined to protect anyone who showed them kindness. The fire started on a Tuesday in late summer, 6 months after Jack had found the sisters in the snowstorm. Lightning struck dry timber about 15 miles east of his ranch, and within hours high winds had pushed the flames into a massive wildfire that threatened everything in its path. Jack stood on his porch watching orange smoke billows on the horizon, listening to his battery radio announce mandatory evacuations for everyone within a 20-mile radius. The fire was moving fast, driven by winds that kept changing direction. The announcer said it had already burned through 10,000 acres and was completely out of control. We need to load the livestock trailer and get the cattle out of here, Jack said to Ayana and Chenoa, who were standing beside him watching the approaching smoke. The evacuation order includes this whole area. Both sisters shook their heads firmly. We're not leaving, Ayana said. This is your home, your life's work. We won't abandon it. You don't understand, Jack replied, trying to stay calm. This isn't like the other problems we've faced. Fire doesn't care how strong you are or what traditions you follow. It burns everything in its path. Chenoa pointed to the eagles circling overhead. There were more of them now, dozens wheeling through the smoky air. The spirits are still here. They haven't fled from the fire. That means this place can be defended. By evening, the fire was close enough that Jack could see actual flames dancing along the ridgeline. The heat was so intense it made the air shimmer, and ash was falling like gray snow across his pastures. Most of his neighbors had already evacuated, loading their animals into trailers and heading for emergency shelters in town. Jack had called his insurance company and his lawyer, making sure his papers were in order in case the worst happened. But when he suggested loading his most important belongings into his truck, the sisters refused to help him pack. We didn't survive that blizzard just to run away from fire, Ayana told him. Our grandmother always said that when you find a place worth defending, you defend it with everything you have. This is crazy, Jack said. We're 3 people against a wildfire. There's nothing we can do to stop it. That's when Chenoa explained their plan. It was so dangerous and impossible that Jack's first instinct was to refuse completely. But looking at the determination in both women's eyes, he realized they were going to try it with or without his help. They spent all night creating fire breaks around the most important parts of Jack's ranch. Using their incredible strength, the sisters dug trenches and cleared vegetation faster than a crew with heavy machinery could have managed. They moved his cattle to the safest pasture, near the artesian well that never ran dry, and built temporary shelters using materials they gathered from around the ranch. When the fire reached Jack's property line the next afternoon, it hit defenses that shouldn't have been possible for 3 people to create in one night. But the sisters had done more than just dig ditches and clear brush. They'd somehow convinced the land itself to help fight the fire. Water started bubbling up from underground springs that Jack had never known existed, creating muddy barriers that slowed the flames. The wind, which had been driving the fire forward all day, suddenly shifted and started blowing the flames back on themselves. Even the eagles were helping, diving down to snatch burning branches and carrying them away from Jack's buildings. But the real test came when a massive wall of fire, 30 feet high and moving like a freight train, roared toward Jack's house. The heat was so intense it started blistering the paint on his barn from 200 yards away. This wasn't something that fire breaks or water could stop. This was the kind of inferno that turned everything to ash. That's when Chenoa did something that Jack would never forget as long as he lived. She ran directly toward the wall of fire, not away from it. Jack screamed for her to stop, but she kept running until she was standing right in the path of the advancing flames. For a moment, Jack thought he was about to watch her die, but instead of being consumed by the fire, Chenoa seemed to grow larger and more solid. She spread her arms wide and planted her feet, facing down the inferno like an ancient warrior challenging an enemy army. The fire hit her and stopped. Not just slowed down or turned aside, but actually stopped moving forward. The flames rose higher, roaring with frustration. But they couldn't advance past where Chenoa stood. It was like she'd become an immovable barrier that the fire couldn't cross. Ayanna was doing something similar on the other side of the ranch, standing in the path of flames that were trying to reach Jack's cattle. Both sisters had somehow made themselves into human fire breaks, using their bodies and their will to protect everything Jack cared about. The standoff lasted for 3 hours. Jack could see the strain on both women's faces, the enormous effort it took to hold back forces that should have been unstoppable. Sweat poured down their faces despite the scorching heat, and their hands shook from the effort of containing destruction itself. Then disaster struck. A burning tree, weakened by the fire, fell directly toward Chenoa. She was so focused on holding back the wall of flame that she didn't see it coming. Jack ran toward her, shouting a warning, but he was too far away to help. The tree crashed down across Chenoa's back, driving her to her knees. The impact broke her concentration, and the wall of fire surged forward. Jack reached her just as the flames were about to engulf them both. Without thinking, Jack threw himself over Chenoa, using his own body to shield her from the falling embers and blazing branches. He felt the fire sear his back and arms, smelled his own hair burning, but he didn't move. For the first time since the sisters had come to his ranch, he was the one protecting them instead of the other way around. That's when Ayanna's voice rang out across the burning landscape, speaking words in Apache that seemed to make the earth itself tremble. The fire suddenly died down. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had turned off a giant burner. Rain began falling from clouds that hadn't been there moments before, heavy drops that turned to steam when they hit the hot ground. Within minutes, the wildfire that had threatened to destroy everything was reduced to smoldering patches of ash. Jack helped Chenoa to her feet, both of them burned and exhausted but alive. Around them, his ranch stood untouched, protected by forces he would never fully understand. As they walked back toward the house through the falling rain, Chenoa leaned heavily on Jack's shoulder. She was hurt worse than she wanted to admit, but she was smiling through the pain. "The debt is paid," she whispered. "You saved my life just as we saved yours. The sacred obligation is complete." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. After everything they'd been through together, after all the impossible things he'd witnessed, the idea of losing the sisters now seemed unbearable. But he knew that their traditions were sacred to them, and a life debt that had been repaid was no longer binding. The question was, would they choose to stay anyway, or would honoring their obligations mean saying goodbye? The weeks after the fire were the longest of Jack's life. Chenoa spent most of her time recovering from her injuries, moving slowly and sleeping more than usual. Her burns were healing with the same supernatural speed that seemed to govern everything about the sisters, but Jack could tell she was still in pain. More importantly, both women had begun preparing to leave. They mended their few possessions, studied maps of the region, and spoke quietly together in Apache about places they might go next. The life debt was complete, and according to their traditions, they were free to return to their wandering life. Jack tried to act normal, going about his daily ranch work and pretending he wasn't watching every move they made. But inside, he felt like he was losing his family all over again. Worse than that, he was losing people who had brought magic and purpose back into his world. The ranch itself seemed to sense the approaching departure. The supernatural protections that had manifested after the sisters' arrival began to fade. The extra water in his wells dropped back to normal levels. The eagles that had circled his property for months started flying away, one or two at a time. Even the grass in his pastures looked less green and vibrant. On a Thursday morning, exactly 8 months after he'd found them in the snowstorm, Jack woke up to find both sisters sitting at his kitchen table, with their few belongings packed and ready to go. They'd prepared breakfast for him one last time, and the smell of traditional Apache bread filled the house. "We'll be leaving after breakfast," Ayanna said quietly. "We wanted to thank you properly for everything you've done for us." Jack sat down at the table, his appetite gone. "Where will you go?" "North, probably," Chenoa replied. "We heard about a rancher in Montana who needs help with his cattle operation. Temporary work, but it would give us time to figure out what comes next." Jack nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "That sounds good. You'll do well wherever you end up." They ate in uncomfortable silence, all three of them knowing this would be their last meal together. Jack found himself memorizing everything about the moment. The way morning light came through his kitchen window, the sound of Ayana humming softly while she cleaned the dishes, the sight of Chenoa carefully folding the blankets they'd used during their recovery. Finally, Jack couldn't stand it anymore. "I need to tell you both something," he said. "These past 8 months, they've been the best time I've had in years, maybe the best time I've ever had." Both sisters stopped what they were doing and looked at him. "Before you came here, I was just going through the motions," Jack continued. "Getting up, doing chores, going to bed, repeat. I had this ranch, but I didn't have a life. You changed that. You made me remember what it feels like to have people to care about, people who care about me." Ayana's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You gave us something too, Jack. For the first time in our lives, we found a place where we could use our gifts without hiding them, where we could be ourselves completely." "Then why are you leaving?" Jack asked. "I mean, I understand about the life debt being paid, but that doesn't mean you have to go. This is your home now, if you want it to be." Chenoa shook her head sadly. "We can't stay without the sacred obligation. It wouldn't be right. We have no claim on this place, no reason to be here." "Yes, you do," Jack said, standing up from the table. "You have the best reason in the world. You have someone who loves you like family and wants you to stay." The kitchen went completely quiet. Outside, Jack could hear his cattle lowing in the distance, but inside the house, nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, Jack took a deep breath and said what he'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want to offer you both a legal partnership in this ranch. Not as employees, not because of any debt, but as full partners. Equal ownership, equal say in all decisions, equal share of any profits." Both sisters stared at him in shock. "You've already improved this place more than I ever could alone," Jack continued. "With your help, we could build something really special here. A working ranch that honors both modern needs and traditional ways. A place where people like you don't have to hide their gifts." Ayana was the first to find her voice. "Jack, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't accept ownership of your family's land. This ranch has been in your family for generations, and it's going to die with me if I don't have partners to help run it." Jack replied honestly. "I'm 52 years old, unmarried, no kids. When I'm gone, this place gets sold to developers who'll turn it into a golf course. Is that really better than sharing it with people who love it as much as I do?" Chenoa stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the pastures where Jack's cattle grazed peacefully. "We've never owned anything before," she said quietly. "Never had a permanent home. The idea scares us." "It scares me too," Jack admitted. "But good things are supposed to be a little scary. That's how you know they matter." Ayana joined her sister at the window. "What would people say? 3 unmarried adults living together, running a ranch as partners?" Jack laughed. "People already talk about us. They've been gossiping for months about the giant Apache women living on my ranch. Might as well give them something interesting to gossip about." The sisters spoke quietly to each other in Apache for several minutes. Jack couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion in their voices, the way they were working through something important together. Finally, they turned back to face him. "Our grandmother always told us that family isn't just about blood," Ayana said. "She said the strongest bonds are the ones you choose, the people you decide to stand with through good times and bad." Chenoa nodded. "We've stood with you through blizzards and fires, through officials and developers and tribal politics. If you're willing to trust us with your family's legacy, then we're willing to trust you with our future." The partnership papers were signed the following week with a lawyer in town who kept staring at the sisters and asking if they were professional athletes. Jack had the ranch surveyed and officially divided into 3 equal shares, with the house and main buildings held in common ownership. 6 months later, Morrison Apache Ranch had become one of the most successful cattle operations in the state. Word had spread about the ranch run by a man and 2 Apache sisters who could accomplish impossible things. They got premium prices for their cattle, which were healthier and stronger than any others in the region. More importantly, they'd become the kind of family that Jack had never expected to have. Ayana and Chenoa brought traditions and perspectives that enriched every aspect of ranch life. Jack brought knowledge and connections that helped them navigate the modern world of business and bureaucracy. On winter evenings, they'd sit around the kitchen table planning improvements for the next year, or listening to Ayana tell stories their grandmother had passed down. Sometimes Chenoa would sing traditional Apache songs that seemed to make the house itself feel more alive and welcoming. The eagles returned, more of them than ever before. The wells flowed strong and clear. The pastures stayed green longer into each season. Whatever spiritual protections the sisters had brought to the land seemed to have become permanent, tied now to bonds of choice rather than obligation. Jack still couldn't fully explain how his life had changed so dramatically. How saving two strangers in a snowstorm had led to the family and purpose he'd never known he was missing. But every morning when he woke up and heard his partners already working outside, every evening when they gathered around his grandmother's old table to share a meal, he knew he'd found something worth more than any treasure. The life debt had been paid long ago. What remained was something much more powerful. The conscious choice to build a life together, to protect each other not from obligation but from love, and to prove that family can be found in the most unexpected places and the most impossible circumstances.